And I want to make sure that we do justice to all the work that was done by the panelists in preparing things for their presentation. So I do want to get started. We also are unfortunately going to lose some of our Washington University friends right after the conference is over because they've got to catch a flight. So I do want to make sure that we don't roll over too much over time. And I know there'll be people rolling in because it's a Thursday, there's lots of classes going on, students will be coming in later, but we can get started on our conversation among us. So good morning, everybody. I guess I don't need to reintroduce myself because most of you, or many of you, were here last night, but I'm Diane Davis and the chair of the Department of Urban Planning Design here at the GSD. And these are welcoming remarks to our conference, which you all know the title of. It's right up there on the screen. Before beginning, I have just a few things I want to say, but I will begin with thanking our colleagues at Washington University in St. Louis for their participation, support, and collaboration in this event. The idea for the conference and its evolution was hatched in a conversation with faculty both here at the GSD, Eve Blau-Dandoka, myself originally, and then adding Tony Griffin and Stephen Gray, but it also developed in parallel with folks at the Sam Fox School of Design and the Center for Humanities at Washington University, which is hosting what's called the Divided Cities Initiative there about St. Louis, and I'll say a little more about that later in my remarks. And I was out in St. Louis. Eve's been out in St. Louis. We've had conversations. People like Eric Mumford are here, who is here with the group from Washington University, have a bit of a history of relationship with the GSD. So it's my great pleasure that we are starting, that we're working together on this project, and I'm hoping there'll be more things developing in the future. And that is that we're just beginning the conversation and collaboration about St. Louis, and we want to think about ways that maybe together we can address the many social, racial, spatial, urban planning and design challenges that St. Louis faces, and that we heard about so eloquently last night from our keynote speakers. So today's presentations broadly span a range of disciplines housed both within and outside our school, that is the GSD, ranging from planning, design, and architecture to history, sociology, geography, anthropology, and the law, among others. Near the end of the day, and for most of tomorrow, we will also then move more directly into practice-based work. So we have activists also involved in our panels today, but as well tomorrow with the student work that has been interrogating race and design in St. Louis and other American cities. So I'm hoping that together the kind of mix of disciplines that we're starting to unfold today, and then moving into more practice and activism later today and tomorrow, will evoke the nature of the challenge that we're trying to address in convening all these voices together. I think also you'll see tomorrow the sheer commitment of our students and their faculty and advisors to directly addressing issues of race and spatial injustice in American cities more broadly, but I'm, again, getting ahead of myself. We will hear a little more about the objectives of our students and what they'll be doing tomorrow. Later today, I'm going to ask Professor Stephen Gray to say a little more. He said something last night, but later at the end of the conference, before the reception, just to give you a prelude about what the students are doing. But overall, we have three general aims in this day and a half that we have left. One is to raise questions about the history of St. Louis, particularly in terms of patterns and practices of race, space, and design. Second, to ask how these patterns and practices came to be and how they work now in St. Louis. And three, to link those questions and processes to the current developments and the future of St. Louis, thinking about disinvestment, dispossession, extreme racial segregation, forms of policing, pervasiveness of poverty and social exclusion for the city's poor citizens, many of them African American, and even to potentially think about restorative planning and design practices. And I really want to emphasize that latter objective even though we're starting out with an amazing panel on the kind of history and the evolution of the city, the aim of the conference is not merely to establish the origins and nature of the terrible urban conditions that have come to define contemporary St. Louis, many of which hit the headlines with the Michael Brown shooting, but those who live in St. Louis have been knowing and living and feeling these conditions for a long time. But my point here is that we are engaging these issues in order to produce new and hopefully more innovative and creative ways of remedying or reversing the conditions. Stated another way, our aims here are both analytical and prospective. We hope to use the knowledge and dialogue produced today by the experts in this room in the service of producing new practices that might help address some of the most fundamental problems in St. Louis and other American cities today. In methodological terms, with today's event, we're trying to break down long-standing interdisciplinary silos in the study of cities, not just between the different humanities and the social sciences and the design fields, but particularly, and this is my key objective, within the latter, within the design fields. As we know very well from at least the halls of the GSD, urban designers do not always engage urban planners when it comes to city building, just as urban planners, designers, architects may fail to articulate their aims with a view to larger historical conditions and how they produced particular social, spatial, political, or ecological landscapes. These different perspectives all must be acknowledged as producing the urban condition. And with a focus on a single city, as we do here with respect to St. Louis, it will be more difficult to maintain a narrow disciplinary view. And that's, in a way, what we're trying to do today is blast out of that narrow disciplinary view. Having written a book on a single city myself, I have long been an advocate for deeply grounded study of particular places, not just because this type of exercise allows one to understand the multiplicity of factors that produce the built, natural, and social environment of a city, but also because by deeply grounding the study of a place in facts, the relationship between the universal and the particular will reveal itself, or at least hopefully. So reframed in the context of St. Louis, we have the opportunity to see whether and how the specificities of this particular historically contested city, with its unique political, social, economic, and spatial history, has produced the problems and challenges of racial injustice that capture our attention today in any unique way? Or is it really following processes and patterns that we would see anywhere across urban America? So we are compelled to put the arguments that we will see and hear about with respect to the evolution of St. Louis in the context of larger political dynamics and developments in urban America, and ask what's unique and what's universal. And if that's not in the particular presentations, it will be part of the conversation, I'm hoping. And in a few minutes, the panel that I'm moderating, the history panel, that's kind of one of the overarching questions. So hopefully we'll be able to come back to that. I do have to admit that much of this ambition is very personal, and it comes from my own work and the issues I've been struggling with as a historical urban sociologist in a planning and design school. Most of my work has been on conflict cities with lots of violence and police corruption, social spatial exclusion, an array of urban injustices, but outside of the United States. I'm a Latin Americanist. Becoming a St. Louis specialist, I'm hoping, in the future. And in particular, as you saw in the bio, I've done a lot on the history of policing in Mexico City, the 20th century history of policing, and that's my next project on St. Louis. So, but my own curiosity about these questions about the universal and the particular was piqued by the fact that as a native St. Louisan, I have been for a while working on questions of the city's role in the larger processes of U.S. state formation, understood both in terms of geographic territory, as with the Louisiana Purchase, and in terms of political membership, citizenship, as with the Missouri Compromise and Civil War. These are questions I've been looking at in the context of a place like Mexico, which had a revolution and struggled over sovereignty for much of and many other Latin American countries over the late 19th and early 20th century. So the themes about state formation and citizenship and membership and how cities and kind of national imaginaries unfold in a relationship with each other has been a common question in the Latin American literature, but I haven't seen it as much in the US literature. So when I started thinking more about my hometown, St. Louis, through the lens of the work that I'd done in other places, I began to see that I had new questions about St. Louis that I really wanted to pursue. So there's an example of taking the opportunity or an occasion to break down the developmental or global divides in the academic study of cities. I myself am thinking, what do I know about the Latin American context that informs what's happening in St. Louis and its role in the national imaginary and vice versa? Now, it's not the job of this conference to think globally yet. Maybe that'll be something we do in the future. But I do want to say that the concept of the divided city, which is the title of the Mellon Initiative at Washington University, is exactly a concept that allows us to think globally. We think about Belfast, we think about Jerusalem, we think about national conflicts between the urban and the national in other parts of the world, and it's really time to think about that here in the United States as well as in St. Louis in particular. So back to St. Louis. Well, anyway, I do want to say that I'm hoping, and if everybody who's here is interested in continuing the conversation beyond St. Louis and thinking about the back and forth between a particular city and other cities in the U.S. where we can frame it in terms of these questions of citizenship, sovereignty, state formation, I think maybe that's something that we can also pursue down the road. I know when I spoke to Jean Allman at the Divided Cities Initiative at Washington University, she had mentioned explicitly that many of the team at Washington University are interested in like South Africa and other parts of the world, not only St. Louis. So I do see that as a possibility for the future. But back to St. Louis. We're here today to reflect on the forms of knowledge production and practice that may come from a focus on a single city by a wide range of disciplinary experts. What can we learn about St. Louis past, present, and future by introducing a wide range of voices and visions into the debate among historians and lawyers, designers, planners, geographers, environmentalists? And that's kind of a prelude to our next panel. But before I introduce our first panel, let me just give some more thanks. There is mention in the program. You'll see that the interdisciplinary ambitions of this conference are reflected to a large degree by its financial supporters that range from the Mellon Foundation, which has funded the Divided City Initiative, but also we have a program here at Harvard that Eve Blau is directing, looking at the relationship between the humanities and the urban. So the Mellon Foundation has supported us from both institutions. We're also supported by the Urban Planning and Design Department's Interdisciplinary Urbanism Initiative, something that we've unfolded here in the last couple years. It's a group of faculty from across the university who are interested in urban questions, sociology, public health, law, political science, anthropology. They are sponsors of this program as well as the GSD, and I do want to thank Mohsen Mostafavi for giving us funds to help pull off this conference. So again, final thanks to Chantel Blakely, who does everything with respect to these events and has been working like a maniac the last couple weeks on it, corresponding with you all and getting dinner reservations and like airfare, and without Chantel it wouldn't have been possible. Also, my intrepid graduate student assistant, Catherine Prater, who's also been in contact with many of you, and Eve, Dan, Tony, and Stephen, who will be moderating other panels later today. So without further ado, I want to welcome you to the conference and turn our attention to the first panel, which I'm going to be moderating. And what we will do today is we will have individual speakers come up here, and then at the end, we'll all sit on the table for questions and answers conversation. So today's panel, as you saw in the description, this morning's panel addresses history. And I do want to mention that we are going to slightly reverse the order of the speakers to be a little more true to the chronology, the historical chronology. So we will begin with Walter Johnson. And after Walter speaks, we will move to Colin Gordon, and then Ken Reardon, and then Jill Decimini. I would like to say a little something about our speakers. Again, we have extended bios in the program, so I don't want to repeat those, waste time on that. But I do want to add about Walter, in addition to the existing bio, which you can read if you have your magnifying glass, that he is the director of the Charles Warren Center for Studies in American History, a research center for North American history here at Harvard. The Warren Center has, over the past 50 years, brought hundreds of faculty and postdoctoral fellows to Harvard and awarded significant funds to generations of Harvard students, both graduate and undergraduate. Johnson has served as an advising scholar for the award-winning PBS documentary, Prince Among Slaves, produced by United Production Foundation. And I might just add a little footnote. I saw in the Boston Globe today that our president, Drew Faust, came out with a statement, Harvard statement on the issue of slavery, and maybe you'll have a chance to say something about that, but I'm very proud that I know Drew is a colleague of Walter's, and I think it's a great day for Harvard having made that statement. Cullen Gordon is probably known as the kind of the historian of 20th century St. Louis. His book and extensive works focus on the transformation of metropolitan St. Louis in the 20th century, particularly focusing on local regulation of land use, restrictive deed covenants, etc. We'll probably hear more about that. But for me, it's so important for a historian to be looking at these kind of planning regulations and techniques that many of us are using now and dealing with in the contemporary urban setting, and understand their historical role in the creation of cities like St. Louis. Ken Reardon, who has just moved to the Boston area, is an expert in neighborhood and community planning, participatory research, community health, and planning. He's written a lot about race, politics, and urban distress. His focus, as we will hear more about, is on East St. Louis, and we really wanted to be conscientious about thinking about the region in general, not just kind of, as you all know or will know soon, the St. Louis region is very fragmented politically as well as ecologically. So thinking about East St. Louis on the other side of the river raises some of the same challenges thinking about St. Louis and its relationship to the county, even if there are different, maybe it's social ecologies, not natural ecologies, that creates that division. So it's great having Ken with us. And then we'll end with Jill Desimini, who's a professor here in the Department of Landscape Architecture. Jill and I, when word about this conference started filtering around the GSD, Jill came up to me and said, I'm doing some work on St. Louis, several different projects having to do with landscape, both at many scales, both micro and in particular neighborhoods, but as well as a kind of understanding the larger Mississippi Basin region. And we're going to hear from Jill about that. Jill has a Master of Landscape Architecture from Pennsylvania, and she has a background in urban studies from Brown University. So without further ado, let's turn the mic over to Walter Johnson.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you, Chantel, for all your work in tracking me down. It's an honor for me to be here. I always say that. It's also humbling. I usually say that. Sometimes it's not true. Sometimes I'm thinking, man, they're so lucky they got me out here. But in this instance, I'm a novitiate, and so it's a great opportunity for me. When I started looking into the history of St. Louis in the fall of 2014, the thing that I was most struck by is how many of the events that we consider to be the central events in the history of the United States, and particularly in the African-American history of the United States, occurred in St. Louis. And that spurred me to further research. I'm going to talk about the 19th century today. I want to talk about the Compromise of 1820, the lynching of Francis McIntosh, the murder of Elijah Lovejoy. All of these events, and then finally the Dred Scott case, of course, all these were events that were nationally determinative of the debate that we have considered to be a debate about slavery. They all happened in the history of St. Louis. But what I want to try to suggest as I go today is that there's something slightly more complicated than a discussion of slavery that's happening in this. I want to try to pull out an obsessional concern with free people of color and to try to articulate that to you as a commitment to white supremacy in excess of pro-slavery, and sometimes actually in contradiction to pro-slavery. So I want to try and use the terms pro-slavery and white supremacy as not equivalent terms. I'm doing something that I promised myself I will never do, which is moving back and forth between a written text and a sort of extemporaneous exegesis. So you'll have to bear with my crappy performance. The paper is entitled Unconstitutional Whiteness, and it has an epigraph from W.E.B. Du Bois' Black Reconstruction. The epigraph is about a lynch mob. Before the wide eyes of the mob is ever the shape of fear. Back of the writhing, yelling, cruel-eyed demons who break, destroy, maim, and lynch and burn at the stake is a knot, large or small, of normal human beings. And these human beings are desperately afraid of something. Of what? On the 28th of April, 1836, Franklin McIntosh, a free black steward aboard the steamboat Flora, alighted on the levee in St. Louis. Best as anyone could tell later, as McIntosh crossed the levee and walked into town, he was overtaken by a pair of sailors who were running from the police. Whether he impeded the police, ignored their shouted commands to help them, or simply did not understand what was happening around him, McIntosh was taken into custody. As they neared the jail, McIntosh drew a knife from his coat and cut the throat of one of the policemen. He then ran down 4th Street toward Market, passing as he did across the front of the courthouse square where a decade later, Dred Scott would file suit against his owner. He made it as far as Walnut Street, where he was surrounded by as many as 50 men, taken to jail and locked in a cell. Outside the jail, a crowd began to gather. Finally, a group of men forced their way into the jail, seized the key to McIntosh's cell from the overwhelmed sheriff, and pulled the black man outside. The mob dragged him a couple of blocks up Chestnut Street, where they tied him to a tree. Members of the neighborhood fire company stacked wood around his feet. McIntosh was silent as they worked. Only as the flames rose around him did he begin to pray and scream. The lynching of Francis McIntosh caught the attention of the United States of America. One of those whose attention it caught was Abraham Lincoln, who was at that time a state senator in Illinois, and Lincoln gave what is one of his first famous speeches about the lynching of Francis McIntosh, and that's called the Lyceum Speech. In January, Lincoln had basically one known political position at this time, which is that he was a fierce and passionate advocate of colonization, of taking free people of color and sending them to Africa. And so one of the things that I want to try to bring out as I talk about this is the way that different ideas, actually global, continental ideas of racial governance circulate through this history. So Lincoln's Lyceum speech was on the theme of the perpetuation of our political institutions, and it remains one of the most pointed and eloquent defenses of the rule of law in the annals of American intellectual history. Lincoln argued that the lynching of McIntosh augured the, quote, increasing disregard for law which pervades our country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of the courts and the worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. As he would 20 years later in the House Divided speech, Lincoln invoked a notion of domestic space in order to explain what he meant. Let reverence for the laws be breathed in by every American mother to the lisping babe that prattles on her lap. And then most famously, in short, let it, i.e., respect for the rule of law become the political religion of the nation. The body of McIntosh, which was left out after being burned, taught a different lesson in St. Louis, at least according to the judge who convened the grand jury meant to investigate the lynching as a crime. The lynching of McIntosh, I think it's probably arguable, was the first lynching of an African-American man, a free man of color in the history of the United States, of the sort of classic lynching form, which is to say somebody is taken from state custody and then burned by a mob. That judge was the judge who convened the grand jury, was, with a kind of grim irony, named Judge Lawless. When it came to time to instruct the jury about their legal responsibilities, Judge Lawless noticed that a lynch mob was indeed a force unauthorized by law, and that burning at the stake at the hands of the mob was indeed a mode of death forbidden by the Constitution. But unlike Lincoln, in the burning of McIntosh, Lawless discerned a principle of even higher import to the community, a higher law than the Constitution. The mob had responded at once to the murder of Hammond, the piteous tears of his widow and orphans at the scene, and, quote, similar atrocities committed in this and other state by individuals of Negro blood against their white brethren. Lawless continued, for him, McIntosh had been the incendiary, he uses the word incendiary, the product of a doctrine of abolition and the fiery, unreasoning mind of a free Negro. In the crowd, Lawless discerned, quote, a mysterious, metaphysical, and almost electric frenzy. And that's the frenzy that I want to call whiteness. That's the question that I want to ask along with W.E.B. Du Bois, is what is that frenzy? Understood that way, understood in the way that Lawless understood them, the actions of the lynch mob were in fact concomitant with the constitutional theory under which Missouri had entered the Union. The Missouri Compromise started on February 13th, 1819, when New York Representative James Talmadge added a rider to the Missouri Statehood Bill that came to consume Congress for almost a year, shaped the legal history of slavery and the constitutional history of the United States for the next 45 years, up until the time the issues it raised had been adjudicated in the shape of 600,000 dead on the battlefields of the Civil War. Missouri should be admitted, the Talmadge Amendment read, only provided that the further introduction of slavery or involuntary servitude be prohibited except for the punishment of crimes. Whereof the party shall have been fully convicted, and that all children born within the said state after the admission thereof into the Union shall be free at the age of 25 years. This momentous question, like a fire bell in the night, awakened and filled me with terror, wrote Thomas Jefferson. A lot of this paper is about fire, right? So Thomas Jefferson, a slaveholder. What does a fire bell in the night mean to a slaveholder? A fire bell in the night to a slaveholder is an image of a fearful uprising, of arson, right? Jefferson went on then, holy smokes, 5 minutes left. That was like a fire bell in the night for me. Jefferson went on to discuss the Missouri Compromise as articulating a geographical line coinciding with a marked principle of moral and political. And so what Jefferson says is that the Missouri Compromise, resolved at the 36-30 line, draws a line between what's going to be slavery and freedom, right? That's not what they think it means in Missouri, though. The Missouri Compromise is passed by the House and the Senate. It goes out. Missouri has the opportunity to write a constitution. That is the Constitution of 1820. It's written in 38 days at the Mansion House Hotel in St. Louis. The Constitution that Missouri sends back, in addition to sanctioning slavery, directs the legislature of the new state to, quote, prevent free Negroes and mulattoes from coming to and settling in this state under any pretext whatsoever. That provision reflected the particular sort of white supremacy that defined the emergent non-slaveholding and working-class white population of the state of Missouri and the city of St. Louis. It reflected the interests and perspective of the migrants who had come to Missouri in the years after 1816, seeking land and economic advancement, men whose hopes had been diminished or dashed by the Depression of 1819. Angry, entitled, wounded white men whose own interests had an unsteady relationship to those of slaveholders. Men who might hold out hope one day of becoming slaveholders, but also men for whom the political preferment of slaveholders was an occasionally galling constraint on their own skin privilege. The cry has been rained. Missouri for white men, recalled the free black barber and chronicler of black life in St. Louis, Cyprian Clamorgan. For these white men, and this is where I want to turn to a kind of a global vision of racial governance, because we have to understand that these white men are the same white men who turned William Clark. Well, they don't turn him out of office, but they vote against William Clark in his effort to become the first state governor in 1820, on the basis that William Clark, who is the greatest Indian remover in the history of the United States, is not removing Indians fast enough, right? For these white men, Indians were a barrier to cheap labor, to cheap land, and free blacks a barrier to high wages. Seen in this light, Indian removal and Negro exclusion were politics of a peace, projects of ethnic and racial cleansing designed to control the economic, political, and social development of St. Louis and the state of Missouri. So, in closing, what I'm going to do is just simply race to the end of the story. The Missouri sends their state constitution back to Washington. There's a huge debate in Washington about whether or not this exclusion of free blacks is unconstitutional, which it patently is on the basis of the Interstate Comity Clause. You can't deny a citizen of one state their rights that they have in that state. You can't discriminate against the citizens of other states under the Interstate Comity Clause. They pass a kind of a covering clause which says that nothing in the Missouri State Constitution shall be taken to mean this, which Missouri lives under as they pass a series of ever more punitive laws against free people of color. Free people of color can't have any weapons without a license. All free children of color between the ages of 7 and 21 will be apprenticed out under the supervision of the county courts, right? Free people of color need a license to live in Missouri unless they're a citizen of the other state. These are laws that are passed in 1835, 1837, 1843, and then finally in 1847, the state of Missouri actually passes what everyone would take to be a reiteration of the Constitution of 1820. Free people of color shall not be allowed into the state of Missouri under any pretext whatsoever. So what there is in the years leading up to the Dred Scott case, I would argue, is a pattern of both implicitly and finally overtly unconstitutional commitments to white supremacy that are made in reaction, I would suggest, to the particular situation of Missouri as a place right on the border with Illinois, as a place where some people are being kidnapped and sold into slavery down the Mississippi River, where others are being enticed away into the Underground Railroad. And a place that has the sort of commercial flows around free black seamen and a black middle class formation that comes with the capitalist development of the Mississippi River Valley. So there's a contradiction there between the capitalist development in relationship to a slaveholding imperialist society and then the sorts of people that it creates who are inimical to the privileges of of whiteness, to the claimed privileges of white supremacy. I'm sorry that that got so rushed, but I'm following the rules.
I want to pick up on some of these essential themes, particularly the notion of citizenship as it plays out. I'm going to jump ahead in time quite substantially. And I'm interested not only in the sort of fundamental divide between white and African American citizenship as it plays out in a border state and a border city, but also the way in which that citizenship is sort of fractured and segmented in space in the metropolitan area itself. 2 years ago, August, Michael Brown was shot in Ferguson. And I think in one respect, we can see this as an episode in policing, as an addition to the roster that includes Eric Garner and Tamir Rice and others. But I prefer to see it in the context of the history of Greater St. Louis, both the city and its suburbs. And I prefer to see it as a story really about citizenship and fractured citizenship. As the civil rights pioneer John Lewis wrote in the wake of Brown's death, quote, "One group of people in this country can expect the institutions of government to bend in their favor, no matter that they are supposedly regulated by impartial law. In the other, children, fathers, mothers, uncles, grandfathers, whole families, and many generations are swept up like rubbish by the hard, unforgiving hand of the law." So as Lewis suggests, I think the encounter between Michael Brown and Officer Darren Wilson rested, in a sense, on this much deeper history of uneven and fragmented citizenship in Greater St. Louis. Who does the state protect? Who does it target? Who are presumptively citizens? And who are considered instead as threats or nuisances or subjects? So I want to illustrate this with some episodes from the history of Greater St. Louis, and I'm going to start with one that Joseph touched on last night, and that is the racial zoning ordinance in 1916. This, I think, was fundamentally about the sort of presumption that African Americans were not full citizens. As the Real Estate Exchange argued at the time, do you realize that at any time you're liable to suffer irreparable loss due to the coming of Negroes into the block in which you live? Now, as Joseph mentioned, the ordinance did not go into effect, but like the mechanisms of segregation generally in Greater St. Louis, what happened was the motives remained the same and they migrated from policy to policy, irrespective of legal setbacks. In fact, the Real Estate Exchange was nonplussed by the Buchanan v. Worley decision in 1917, just as they were by their loss in Shelley versus Kramer in 1947, because they knew there were other mechanisms of accomplishing the same thing. What the realtors did in St. Louis was they established what they euphemistically called an unrestricted zone, meaning that realtors could sell inside this zone to African Americans, but if they sold outside, they would lose their license. They girded this with over 380 schemes of neighborhood restriction, race-restrictive deed covenants, some covering as few as 4 properties, some covering as many as 80. These took 2 forms in the city. The newer developments in the south, these were original to the deeds of the property. The sort of ragged quadrangle in the north is intended to sort of prevent the spread of the African American population from its historic center in the Ville into North and West St. Louis. Importantly for the history of the city, I would argue, is not so much the reach of deed covenants in the city itself, which was largely built up, and these covenants were cobbled together after the fact, but the fact that these were absolutely ubiquitous in the St. Louis suburbs as they were developed. In fact, if you look at the promotional literature for suburbs spilling outside the city, they're almost always advertised as protected, and that's what this means. The enforcement of race-restrictive deed covenants is struck down in Shelley versus Kramer in 1947, but importantly, it lives on in other forms. When the federal government gets into the business of insuring home mortgages and risk-rate neighborhoods, as this map shows, the most important determinant for the appraisers who are walking through the neighborhoods, and this is on their clipboards, is whether the neighborhood was covered by a race-restrictive deed covenant. If it was considered a high-grade neighborhood worthy of federal insurance. If it wasn't, or if the restriction was about to expire, which was noted explicitly, it was coded red or yellow. And this was also, the spirit of these were also incorporated in zoning. In fact, Harlan Bartholomew, the city engineer in 1918, who went on as a private planner to write the zone plan for the entire Missouri suburbs spilling west of the city, noted as early as 1918, when St. Louis was preparing to zone for the first time, that zoning was a means of maintaining race-restrictive deed covenants after their expiration. And this is, in fact, how they were talked about explicitly in the suburbs. Now, in my view, the most important and most destructive part of this story is not necessarily what happens in the city, although these institutions are invented there, but the way in which they're reinvented and replicated in the greater metropolitan area. Particularly given the sort of peculiar political organization of St. Louis and St. Louis County, where the city is its own county. As Joseph mentioned last night, it can't expand. So what happens is you get this dynamic of poaching from the St. Louis suburbs. It's almost as if, if anyone's familiar with the era of wildcat drilling, when people would say, oh, there's a pool of oil there, and everyone would drill sort of on an angle underneath to get the oil. That's what the suburbs at the edge of St. Louis are doing. They're poaching the city of its resources, and in ways that I'll describe. But in order to get a sense of the sort of deeply racial premises of local land use, I want to jump to Elmwood Park in St. Louis County, which is the red spot there nestled between Olivet and Overland. This is a postage stamp of unincorporated land between these two municipalities. And its development looks like this. So the boundaries there are the current boundaries of Olivet and Overland. Elmwood Park is the blue postage stamp there. This is in 1910. You can see the red or a few single-family houses being built. Elmwood Park is an old free black settlement dating from the 1880s. As we move forward in time, we see more houses being built, and not until 1930 is either Olivet or Overland incorporated as a town. As you can see, not much development at the time it's incorporated. Move forward in time, 35, in 1939, Overland is incorporated, but on a much smaller footprint. And then what both municipalities proceed to do is, as new subdivisions are built on unincorporated land, so that private subdividers are making all the crucial land decisions, and then after the fact, they're incorporated into the municipality, with a final incorporation coming in the 1960s. So that by 1965, Elmwood Park remains an unincorporated postage stamp of underserviced development between these two municipalities. Conventional suburbanization flows around these African-American enclaves like rocks in a stream. The sewer lines don't go through. The water lines don't go through. The streets are blockaded. With development complete, St. Louis County then looked around and said, blight. There's no water. There's no sewer. And Elmwood Park is slated for redevelopment. But to add insult to injury, this is what Olivet and Overland do to zone the area. They not only surround Elmwood Park and have none of the crucial infrastructure run through, but they quarantine it with industrial zoning. And then redevelopment. This is Elmwood Park in 1955. The county proposes a redevelopment that calves off a third of the residential, turns it into industrial use. This is it in the midst of redevelopment in 1967. And this is a map of where the residents of Elmwood Park end up. Over 100 African-American families are removed by government action. In the greater St. Louis area between 1950 and 1970, 75,000 are displaced by government action, 90% of them African-American. Under federal urban renewal statutes, if you redevelop land, residential land for residential use, the former residents are supposed to have first dibs at coming back in. The residents of Elmwood Park were given 2 packets of information when their houses were taken. One was an application for public housing in the city. The other was a sort of multi-page redevelopment contract. So if they wanted to build 8 houses, that sort of thing, actually coming back as in a developer. So as you can see, one resident of Elmwood Park moves back after the redevelopment. Most move into already deeply segregated tracts in the city or in the county, as in Kinloch, as you see at the top. So urban renewal in the county and in the city actually hardened the lines of segregation that Joseph talked about last night. The residents of Elmwood Park, horrified at this stream of events, file suit against the Land Reclamation Authority of St. Louis County. That suit goes to the Missouri Supreme Court in 1968, Brooks versus the LCRA. The Supreme Court finds against the plaintiffs on the grounds that because they no longer live there, they don't have standing. So what are the consequences of this pattern of deeply segregating institutions and patterns in the city, and of their sort of replication, particularly in the inner suburbs and the central suburbs of the county? Well, first of all is a dramatic pattern of municipal fragmentation. So this is the city of St. Louis, the sort of crescent on the Missouri. This is the municipal organization of the greater St. Louis region. Somewhere between 90 and 100 municipalities in St. Louis County, depending on the year in which you count them. The important point being that these municipalities, very small, are developed for the express purpose of accomplishing and sustaining racial segregation. Many of them provide very few services. They're really meant to accomplish a couple of things. One is to zone the land, and the second is for each of them to sort of play their part as a sort of in this fragmentary municipal fabric. This is what the municipal footprint of the Ferguson-Florissant School District looks like. Notable here is Berkeley, which is a sort of little donut around Kinloch. Berkeley was incorporated like that in 1937 in order to split the white Berkeley School District from the black Kinloch School District. The second consequence, dramatic decline in disinvestment, as the senator spoke of last night, in North St. Louis. Just a glimpse of that. So here's a Sanborn fire insurance map in North St. Louis circa 1932. You can see how densely developed it is. All these houses are gone. A dramatic racial wealth gap is another consequence. Because African Americans are left off the escalator of wealth creation created by the federal government in the 1930s, African American wealth, while wages and incomes gain during the civil rights era, the wealth gap widens, and it's widened dramatically since the housing crisis. And then you get this pattern of white flight and black flight summarized here on these census maps. As you can see, in-migration for the war, the beginnings of an emptying out of the city, so the orange swaths there is the clearance of the Mill Creek Valley, African Americans moving ahead of the bulldozer into West St. Louis, whites moving further out into the suburbs, and the city largely, especially its north side, depopulating over the course of the 20th century. And the end result, bringing us back to Ferguson, is the phenomena of what urban demographers call second-hand suburbs. Ferguson is an older inner suburb, small footprint land development. It becomes the logical destination for African-American families displaced by urban renewal, displaced by disinvestment in the city, and yet suffering a dramatic racial wealth gap, which makes more dramatic investments in housing impossible. And citizenship remains fragmented. I like this quote from the 1970 hearings because it echoes so much what would happen in Ferguson a generation later. Who are the police there to protect? And then as we look more closely at Ferguson, we see dramatic differences between these inner suburbs and the larger county. And so this is home values in St. Louis County. As sales, here's Ferguson. Sales are foreclosures as a share of sales. Ferguson, 20 to 30% of sales through the crisis and beyond. This fragmentation yields a nasty competition for commercial tax base, partly reflecting Missouri's peculiar sales tax system. so that municipalities sort of compete for big box retail in an insane fashion, and then they give away the tax base in order to attract it. And so Ferguson has tax increment financing districts, which is spilling across the county, an enhanced enterprise zone that covers the campus of Emerson Electric. So what do you do if you cannot raise money with property taxes and you cannot raise money with commercial taxes and you are too small to be fiscally capable? You engage in revenue policing. You push fines and forfeitures up to the maximum the state will allow, in Ferguson going up as high as 20% on the eve of Michael Brown's death. And this, I think, is what enables us to make sense of that tragic event. It's embedded in this long history of fragmented citizenship in which not only Michael Brown, but the inner suburb of Ferguson play a particular role. Thank you.
Well, good morning, Cambridge. My name is Ken Reardon, and I'm a faculty member at the University of Massachusetts' new graduate program in urban planning and community development. And I'm delighted to be here this morning and want to thank Professor Davis for inviting me, and also my former dean, Moisen, who is with us at Cornell for a while on his way to the GSD. It was great to see him last night. And we've heard an extraordinarily eloquent and powerful description of sort of the structural factors that have sort of over time undermined the overall economic vitality and created just breathtakingly deep and painful divisions between the life chances of the dominant Euro-centric population and people of color in the St. Louis region. And I don't think I could add very much more to that story. What I'd like to spend a few minutes this morning talking about is something that really our speakers last night introduced, that throughout this entire history, the early 1800s up through this present moment, there's an extraordinary counter-narrative that's occurring in both sides of the river that rarely gets its attention. And that is the organization of people of color, often under the most difficult and challenging circumstances, to organize around basic human rights. Stories that are often completely overlooked, and when told, are often viewed as unbelievable by folks who have only a distant relationship with this region's history. And how does a nice Irish Catholic boy from the Bronx end up in East St. Louis for a decade? What did I do along my life's trail to end up there? My father asked me. He said he had plenty of good explanations. But in 1990, I was the brand new assistant professor of urban and regional planning at the University of Illinois, where Harlan Bartholomew taught for many years. In fact, I took over Intro to City Planning decades later from his tutelage. And as I walked in as the youngest untenured professor, in my chair said, "Hey, you do community development. You're now the director of the East St. Louis Action Research Project." And being a New Yorker, I didn't have a very good command of Midwestern geography. I still don't in many ways. And I said, I hadn't noticed the signs to East St. Louis around Champaign-Urbana. Where the hell is it? I found out it was 188 miles down the road. And the reason why I assumed this lofty position of leadership is that all the senior faculty who had tenure did the reverse moonwalk when invited to come and participate in the East St. Louis project. And the question is, how does a big state university 200 miles away find a struggling community of color along the river so far from its campus? And like so many things in higher ed, but I'm sure not here at the GSD, it's sort of the low road to morality. The longest sitting African-American woman in any Midwestern state legislature was a remarkable, hellacious, visionary civil rights activist by the name of Yvette Young. And after decades of service in every crappy committee in the State House of Representatives, she became, in 1985, the chairperson of the Higher Ed Finance Committee of the state legislature. And that's a big deal in a place like Illinois, where the land-grant university has almost iconic and godlike stature. In fact, only twice a year does the House and the Senate in Illinois get together. One is for the State of the State speech by the governor, and the second one is by the head of the University of Illinois system comes and talks about the state of the land-grant mission in the state of Illinois. So in 1987, the then president, you couldn't make this up, like Lawless, my colleague, Stanley Eikenberry III, came to the joint House and Senate to give his State of the Campus speech. Why we should get more state aid because our athletes run faster, our scholars jump higher, and the library has more books than anybody else. And as he was about ready to launch into his presentation, in the back of the room stood up Wivetta Young and said, "We'll be interested in what your vision is for the future of the University of Illinois when you can articulate to our satisfaction what your urban public service mission is as a land-grant institution in communities like East St. Louis." And in a nanosecond, we all know higher ed moves slowly, glacially in some ways, the president called together the deans of a variety of schools and said, "In the fall, you will go and do good work in East St. Louis." So the first person to show up to do this good work just across the river from the Dred Scott Courthouse on the East St. Louis side of the river was myself. And I showed up as a bright-eyed, bushy-tailed, recently minted PhD from Uncle Ezra's Day Camp in Ithaca, better known as Cornell. And I started my series of community-based interviews with folks in the healthcare sector, in education, in business, in commerce, and planning with, "Hi, I'm from the university, I'm here to help you." And I again saw people doing the reverse moonwalk, holding their vital organs, protecting themselves. And my favorite quote was from the leader of a grassroots organization who said, quote unquote, "While holding my hand," I thought this was going to be a great relationship building moment. She's holding my hand, she starts squeezing it, squeezing it, squeezing it until it turns pink. And then she says, "The last goddamn thing we need in East St. Louis is another university-trained academic telling us what any sixth grader in town already knows." So my proposal, which was to support local community-based planning efforts with assistance from the Landscape Architecture and Planning Program from the University of Illinois, was not the first idea that local residents had in terms of a path forward. And they needed a path forward. East St. Louis has an extraordinary history. It was called the Pittsburgh of the West. It had the largest rail assembly yard in the United States. It had the second largest steel production facility. As late as the 1940s, it had the second highest industrial wage rates in Illinois and had the highest home ownership rate in the state of Illinois. Extraordinary, and it was a happening place. In fact, in the early 1950s, the National Municipal League and Look magazine pointed to East St. Louis as an all-American city. People can't even imagine that, right? All-American city, most likely to make the transition from an industrial-based economy to a mixed sector economy because of its high competence and business and civic leadership. Well, Look magazine is no longer around, nor is the National Municipal League in the form that it was. So its predictive qualities, could be questioned. Well, within a 20-year period, East St. Louis loses between 16 and 1980, 3/4 of all of its businesses, most of it high-paying, unionized industrial firms. And with that, of course, unemployment skyrockets, median income plummets, and poverty skyrockets as well. In addition, the property tax value, which we've talked about as being the fundamental supporter of public education, property tax base of the city goes from nearly $700 million to just over $100 million in a 20-year period. The city has to raise its property taxes the tax rate in order to try to make up some of the income, but even with that, they can't provide basic services. The first unit to go was the city planning department, and nobody really missed it by the time I got there. But in addition, by 1990, when I arrived, the city had been unable to put its municipal lights on since 1986. It couldn't pay its electric bill. It was unable to have its traffic signals on major intersections operating, couldn't pay its traffic bills. And it didn't collect municipal trash from 86 to 90. Families would send trash home to school with their children in backpacks, and they would dump it in the dumpster on the way to school. So they had eliminated all basic services, even though they had this very, very high tax rate, prompting one HUD official to refer to East St. Louis as Beirut by the river or America's Soweto. Now, this is a story that we've often heard, and it's not unique to an inner ring, older central city like East St. Louis. But beneath the surface, there's really something extraordinary going on that's gotten very little attention. And that is the efforts of an amazing group of African-American women in a neighborhood called Emerson Park, which was the residential center of the packing house workers movement. And this woman on the top left, Ceola Davis, who as a young girl went to a town called Ruleville, Mississippi, as part of an NAACP youth leadership effort to support the voter registration efforts of Robert Moses and the great Fannie Lou Hamer. So extraordinarily touched by that experience, on the way back on a Greyhound bus from Mississippi, these 6 women pledged to each other and to their God that they would create a civic movement not unlike what was happening in Lowndes County to turn their city around and recapture it. This is in 1964, and they slowly began working. Their first project was to identify 3 burnt-out buildings across the street from a daycare facility where their grandchildren went, and they went in and hand by hand disassembled these buildings, deconstructed them, took down 3-story brick buildings, took all of the bricks, had local African-American contractors take it over to Cherokee Street, where nice people in those suburbs we just saw being built out, like the patina of the brick. They raised $12,000, and then for the next year, they ran a program called Don't Cook Tonight, Call Ceola. And they basically sold $5 chicken and fried fish dinners. Raised $20,000, and with that, they designed and built with local labor their first neighborhood playground, the first public space of quality that had been built in the city in 30 years. They called it Shug Park after a great local civil rights leader. And with that, these women said, hey, we did 3 lots on a block. There's only 77 blocks in our neighborhood. There's only 22 neighborhoods in the city. Let's turn the whole goddamn boat around. And they created something called the Emerson Park Development Corporation. They reached out to their state representative, Yvette Young, top right, and said, can't you get the university's attention? She found a pretty good way in 1987 to do that by challenging the university to identify what their commitment was. So I showed up in 1990. There was already this extraordinary group that had put together the Shug Park, and they invited us to work with them in developing the first neighborhood plan. We did it in a bottom-up, bottom-sideways manner, doing lots of door knocking, focus groups, charrettes, et cetera. And within 90 days of the completion of the plan and its adoption by City Council, we implemented our first element with no money, which was a cleanup of the major street going through the neighborhood called 9th Street. Ceola picked it out because she knew that's where the county public works director drove from his office out to his home. And they knew that if they cleaned up the street, they had no money to hire trucks to get rid of the garbage. So we collected 980 bags of garbage, put red ribbons on them, stuck it in the middle of 9th Street. So when this guy drove home, they knew he was an anal, retentive, nice Italian-American guy. He would immediately get the public works trucks out to take it away. That evening on the local TV station, there's a headline, "Neighborhood leaders break law with the help of the University of Illinois to save neighborhood." Within a week, we got a check for $15,000. And I thought people would use the money to hire folks to clean up other sites of illegal dumping. They chose not to. They instead organized local volunteer efforts, cleaned up hundreds of lots over the summer, and used the $15,000 to pay the tipping fees. This was the beginning. The fact that they were able to move from an idea and a plan to implementing something with so little resources got the imagination of a lot of folks who wanted to believe change was possible but had never seen it happen in their lifetime. The cleanup really was the prairie fire, the spark that began to get people's imagination. From there, we started doing scrape-up cleanups with local residents being organized by folks like Ceola and us at the university organizing student help. We did 60 homes, scraped them, painted them. We got free paint from the university. The university colors, Illinois, are orange. Nobody wanted their house painted orange. So we painted a lot of houses blue. Just as we started getting that done, the state treasurer said, we collect tax money, which we give to local banks to hold, and what they have to pay the state for the right to have those profits is quite low, those deposits. How about if we allow you to determine which local bank will hold those profits, and the difference between what the state requires in return for the tax investment and what you can get these banks to compete to give you interest in terms of the right to hold the money will allow you to use to do housing rehab. And that created our first revolving loan fund. Began doing some significant local, small, moderate rehab. With that, we then got a call from the new regional director of HUD who said, how about a home grant? We then started writing home grants and began to mobilize local black contractors through the local church network that we were working with, helped by university students, and we began to do major rehab. This is going along pretty well. And then an extraordinary thing happened. Habitat came to us and said, how would you like to do infill in between? We said, even with the reductions in cost of habitat by volunteer labor, our folks can't afford to pay the monthly mortgage. They said, well, how about if we begin to do something Habitat hadn't done at that point anywhere, which is to take other donations and further write down the mortgage costs. And we began doing new housing. And then I got a phone call on my birthday. Please write this down. This will be on the GSD exam next year, September 15th. My mother always calls me at 5:15, which is when I came into the world and ruined her life, she told me. And that year I got a phone call. My wife hands the phone over. It's probably your mother. It wasn't. It was Ceola Davis. Hey, they're going to build a light rail line from St. Louis Airport to the downtown casino district to get those nice businessmen and women in and out of town. How about if we get it extended through East St. Louis, 8 miles? Extend a rail line, and we've already determined what the route is going to be. What do you think about that? I said, great. Who the hell is this? It was Miss Davis. So we organized something called the 101 Reasons Why the Regional Transportation Plan, and then we had an expletive, which I can't say because I've given my right to have this put on the internet. I don't want to be brought up before the Morals Commission of the Roman Catholic Church. And we worked with Ceola Davis to actually do the route with business students, landscape architecture students, planning students, and we were able to put enough pressure on the regional transportation planning folks to actually extend the Metrolink into East St. Louis, which immediately gave people who had no automobile access to living wage jobs out at the airport or nearby the ability to do that. And that also gave us the ability, as more people got back into employment, their income began to rise, for us to then be able to talk about a major new residential development, which ended up being the Parsons Place project. We recruited Richard Barron, Salazar Company to do it. They partnered with us, 175 units. It's around a drop-dead beautiful Central Park. It also includes a charter school, which has one of the highest attendance rates and school performance improvement rates in the metro region. Why? Because the entire curriculum of that school is focused on community-based planning and development. The kids learn experientially their 3 R's and lots of other things by actually participating in a supportive way with the community building ongoing activities of the elders in their neighborhood. In addition to that, we were able to create the Youth Build Charter School we've just talked about. And then residents came to us and said, we think it's great that there's this partnership, but in order for your students, who are among the brightest and most privileged in our region, to be helpful in our efforts, you provide them with 10 to 12 hours a week of the best graduate education in urban economics, urban design, community development. We, most of whom have never had a chance to spend one day in a university setting, are giving no training. You think you're really engaging in an emancipatory approach to community planning practice, but you're not. You're reinforcing existing racist, sexist, and classist approaches to planning. We're not even the tail in the dog. We're not even the flea hoping to land in the tail of the dog the way you're doing it. That was bad news, hard to hear. But the solution that they proposed was creating in East St. Louis a Highlander-like school for citizen education and research, a free adult school. We then developed a curriculum with community leaders. It offers 10 courses, and 200 East St. Louis leaders went through this school. I want to wrap up by just saying what were the outcomes. $40 million of new development in a neighborhood that no urban professional in 1990 would have said would get a penny. And it happened because of the extraordinary vision and leadership of these women. It encouraged lots of other neighborhoods to get involved in grassroots resident-led planning. It developed its own model of community planning, which I'll just say a word about. It was replicated in several other major cities in the US and internationally. In 1994, we held a UN Urban Development Conference in East St. Louis, the first conference held in East St. Louis since 1974. And this model then was replicated in several other cities in Central, South America, Africa, and Asia, all from East St. Louis. And then finally, an extraordinary impact on the young students who participated. Top left is the recent Housing Commissioner of the City of New York, Rafael Cestero, trained in East St. Louis at the feet of Ceola Davis. Top right, Juan Salgado, a recent winner of the MacArthur Genius Award, founded a terrific charter school and grassroots organization in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, trained in East St. Louis by Ceola Davis and her colleagues. Lower left, Michelle Wetton runs the Enterprise Community Partnership Gulf Coast Initiative, $300 million of post-Katrina development, trained at the feet of Ceola Davis in East St. Louis. And then finally, Kirk Goodrich, who's currently running a private company that does some of the most extraordinary special needs housing. Along the way, the community worked with university folks to evolve its own approach to resident-driven planning and development called empowerment planning and design. And it combines participatory action research, where those most affected by the issues at the local community who have that deep local historical, cultural knowledge, and university-trained folks engage in reciprocal learning in the process of collecting and analyzing data. It gives you better plans, but it doesn't build a political base of power to affect the very powerful public and private interests that determine where investment's going to go. Therefore, we combine that approach with old-fashioned Alinsky-based direct action organizing. Every outreach effort to collect data was a challenge at the end to encourage somebody in the community to get involved in the grassroots effort that was moving the agenda. And finally, to make sure that we understood over time for each issue where to put the maximum political pressure in order to really leverage and move the dial on policy and to create a more even approach, balanced approach to development in East St. Louis, was the popular education proposal that the residents offered us in terms of the creation of the Highlander-inspired Center for Neighborhood Planning. And with that, I want to thank you and turn it over to the next speaker.
Excellent. It's great to be here. I'm not from St. Louis. I've never lived there. I haven't really done any work there, but I've loved my multiple visits to the region. And so I'm thrilled to be a kind of interloper in this conversation, especially if it's regards to history as well, and to offer a few broad reflections on the St. Louis landscape. I think of myself like Henry Shaw, who as a first visitor fell in love with this place. He arrived from England to a land of marshy ground, sinkholes, and Indian burial mounds, and managed to find himself with distant perspective on the landscape, a man from a very different terrain who, as legend had it, found an elevated plateau to overlook the prairie and never turned away. So today, I'm going to be talking about this landscape and maybe trying to imagine it as a continuum rather than a fragment, looking at the hydrologic, geologic, and horticultural legacies of St. Louis. Which button do I press? Green. Let's go with that one. In so doing, I will be exploring how the physical, I'll be exploring how these physical conditions cannot be separated. From the cultural definitions of the territory, how these biophysical characteristics overlay with the socioeconomic issues of race and poverty in the region. Should I try again? Okay. And how an expansive understanding of the landscape bolsters the idea of a fragile terrain, fragile socially, economically, politically, and ecologically. Is it playing? St. Louis is a part of many overlapping and intersecting cultural regions, as was mentioned last night, from the much maligned and not very usefully named Rust Belt, with its implications of social and industrial decline, to the breadbasket or Corn Belt, with its rich soils, advantageous climate, and political support that allow for agricultural dominance. It's a pronounced part of the Mississippi River corridor. It's firmly in the Midwest, but as also was mentioned last night, it's sometimes considered on the northern fringes of the South or the eastern fringes of the West. And it's one of a number of cities that claims itself as the gateway to the West, probably most pronounced, and obviously the only one with a giant arch to do so. That's the Midwest. So. And in some senses, it is the Mississippi watershed that bridges these kind of cultural regions with some ecological regions. I'll sort of point out. So here's the South, a little off. And back. To add to these cultural regions, St. Louis is again part of this Mississippi watershed, a part of the Great Karst region and Ozark Plateau, and a part of USDA Hardiness Zone 6, which descends from northeast Washington to northern New Mexico, across southern Colorado, through Kansas and Missouri, and all the way to northeastern Massachusetts and southern New Hampshire. So here you can say Boston and St. Louis are actually nearly connected. So given St. Louis's membership in all of these regions, I began to think of capturing the identity of the city not as a gateway, but through a sequence of bridges. The city, of course, sits between two major rivers and is connected to its greater region through physical bridges. but it also operates itself as a series of geographical, topographical, temporal, and conceptual bridges. Here, the horizontal expanse of the city is seen as a means of connection, a means of navigating between disparate conditions, a way to tell a story that extends from the past to the future, and to build on legacies to find strongholds within a fragile environment. So, in my limited time, I'm going to try to focus on 7 thematic bridges. The themes are provocations rather than fully formed arguments, with the hopes of raising interesting questions for the symposium and the future work on St. Louis. So I'll start with east to west to mimic much of the way the city first developed from its riverbank inland. To test this idea of St. Louis as a gateway, which has more resonance for me in the past, because inadvertently, in a way, we've gated our city and focused it into closed definition rather than emphasizing it as a way, as a means of connection across multiple territories. And yet the gateway metaphor persists. I heard it stated very recently on some TV coverage of an event in St. Louis. Yet the region, despite the real bridges that cross the Mississippi, there's this great divide perceptually, as we just heard about, between east and west, an unproductive divide that splinters and is reflected physically in the wide gap between each side and in the differential treatment of the banks, where each side, in its unique way, has turned its back on the river, either with a high flood wall or with land use decisions that push people away from the river's edge. It seems nearly impossible to see the water in the city, in either city, much less to find it or smell it or have a view across to the other side. So this is definitely a bridge needing repair. So what about the north to south? The idea that St. Louis is still on the edge of the South, at least from my outside perspective, seems a little bit less of a stretch. I could find more maps of the South that include Missouri than maps of the West with the city in it. And these maps, actually all of the continental, contiguous U.S. maps, have St. Louis in the center of the slide. So you can see that the city and its region does literally sit more in the center of a north-south axis than it does an east-west one. But of course, as we've talked a lot about today and yesterday, on a more zoomed-in scale, there's a perceptual divide between the north and south sides of the city, reinforced by particular lines. Delmore Avenue comes up a lot, that people consider hard boundaries, ones not to be crossed, ones reinforced by economics, by policy, and by development decisions. And if we zoom out again, there's also a north-south break in the way the Mississippi River itself is managed, with the St. Louis district marking the divide between the northern and southern parts. Between the northern river, where navigation is controlled by locks, to the open southern river, where engineered steps are not required for passage. Past emphasis on the northern river has been on maintaining and controlling navigation, where efforts to the south focus more on flood control, which, as everyone knows, isn't to say that it doesn't flood in St. Louis and that there isn't a heavy flood infrastructure, decaying flood infrastructure in the city. So if we return to this section, we see agriculture and industry in the floodplain in the east, and an outdated levee system that's outside of this frame, and the high flood wall in the west, reinforcing this artificial separation between wet and dry terrain. Yet historic CREST data indicates that the wet is often surging into the dry, and the frequency of high water events, as you can see over time, is, like everywhere, is only clearly increasing. So that the floods are happening often, and I would say the memory of the last great flood has not quite faded when the next great flood occurs. And so this is a continuing condition. And further, water is not only a surface concern. So while St. Louis is now a relatively flat city, its built ground sits atop old clay quarries mined in the area south of Forest Park to produce the city's famous brick, and even more notably, atop a porous karst topography that we saw earlier of limestone caves, sinkholes, and abandoned quarries. Here's the pockmarked topography conditions around Benton Park in the late 1800s. And so development has filled the holes in this ground, but it's still quite thin and fragile. You can see evidence of the shifting and subsiding terrain as you drive through the neighborhoods, especially on the south side of the city. And there are pockets under the surface. There's still pockets under the surface with many underground streams running through them. So in addition to the threat of sinkholes in the surface, is the contamination of the groundwater, which further erodes both water quality and the limestone substructure. The significance of karst is exceptional in the city and region, as is the transformation of this terrain for development. The St. Louis caves, of which 20 still exist in a non-accessible and highly altered form, have been used historically for storage, tavern sites, beer cellars, commercial tours, and for the disposal of garbage, sewage, and stormwater. And in the county, where accessible caves still persist, the practice of converting these underground structures into detention basins and culverts for stormwater, it's a crazy proposition given the volatility of the intersection of limestone and water, and urban runoff continues. The caves are very diverse in geologic character, associated with many terrains, including along the Mississippi River bluffs. You can imagine Henry Shaw back there, once creating a dramatic landscape of cliffs, sinkholes, valleys, and caves, a landscape augmented by man-made earthworks like the Cahokia Mounds that once existed on both sides of the river. So this is near the stadium. But today, the highs and lows of the region are much more subtle. So St. Louis is again relatively flat, and perhaps at this regional scale, little can be said about the relationships between topographic elevation and types of development. Often low ground is the least desirable to develop and the quickest to abandon in difficult times. But at this scale, there are too many factors to consider, many of which we've been talking about. And while property abandonment has patterns, it is also extremely pervasive and perhaps irregardless of elevation. So we're going to zoom in and look at Ferguson, which Colin so eloquently described. There's, of course, many key things to say about the events there. But what I was first struck by when I looked at the landscape was the pattern of development. I've been to Ferguson just once, 5 years ago, so I can't say I know it well. But the area that I visited actually looked nothing like this. Here, I was struck by the low ground and the ways in which the fragile terrain, qualities of the ground, and often related political politics contribute to a certain type of development and quality of life. So I was immediately drawn to the idea of the local low points and the stream running across the terrain, and even in Colin's photos, looking at how that sits relative to elevation. So for me, there's a kind of strong image of those in pursuit on high ground and those being pursued on low ground, as well as something extremely unsettling about how development happens on these fragile grounds. But I don't actually want to end there. So the penultimate theme focuses on how, even within a fragile terrain, things can be resilient, and on the undeniably rich horticultural history of the city. So we come back to Henry Shaw. It's home of one of the country's oldest and most preeminent botanical gardens. This is business magnet and lover of the landscape, Henry Shaw's gift to the city. The Shaw property includes the Botanical Garden and Tower Grove Park, his country estate, which to this day is a well-funded and maintained public landscape in the city. The Botanical Garden opened to the public in 1859, and the Shaw legacy continued through the initial work of botanist, Dr. George Egelman, who pushed the public mission of the institution, and through the subsequent scientific genius of botanist Dr. Peter Raven, who directed the gardens from 1971 to 2011 and made the institution's contemporary contributions on par with its historical ones. But I kind of want to open a dialogue between the Botanical Garden, a highly managed and contained horticultural gem that costs to visit, and the spontaneous woodlands that emerge in places of abandonment. They're a testament to the resilience of the fragile social and ecological terrains of the city. And if we look at the perspective as well, the wooded experience offers a moment of respite, a place to cut through one part of the city to another, but also a metaphor for a spontaneous activity that emerges out of lack of resource and planning, which I think actually the last presentation really spoke to amazingly well. And for the overlooked growth that happens amidst dominant narratives of decline, and for things that are actually happening now and have happened in the past 40 years, so a forest can grow for one thing, but many other things can also happen. And for another, we need to start think differently about our investment in landscape. So as you can kind of see in this slide, if we built big parks at the turn of the last century? How will we address the many acres of fallow and vacant lands as this century turns? How will we think about the spontaneous will always be subservient to the cultivated? And more importantly, how will we move from the past to the present to the future? So for me, all of these bridges invoke these temporal shifts and demand a long view of the terrain and its evolution. Thus, I wanted to end with this idea of time and to come back to the Gateway again, this time literally with the current landscape project taking place on the Gateway grounds, both to make parallels between the past and present, between Forest Park and the Gateway. That's how we introduce canopy into the urban condition with an effective robustness. So at the bottom, these are 800 plane trees from the east that have acclimatized themselves in the outer regions of the St. Louis region before making their mark on the river's edge in the city. There's a significant cultural and geographic story there, but one that demands expanding. The gateway cannot be a symbol or a gateway to somewhere else, and the investment cannot have a limited footprint. Instead, we have to move beyond the gates we have created in the past to focus instead on a way to move beyond the symbolic and monumental, the closed and territorial, towards a means of connection, towards bridges that support the fragile terrain on which they land, rather than landing heavily and sort of blind to the context. And so really understanding the particular hydrological, geological, and vegetal legacies, but even more so, I think as we've seen in every presentation, to support the people who rely on this land and need its stability to endure. Thanks.
When all of our panelists come sit up in front, we have a few minutes, I would say 10 minutes at least for questions. Joseph, do you want to start?
Would you like to use it? Oh, I suppose so. Phil Donahue style. That dates me, doesn't it? Yeah, okay, anyway. Sorry, students. So that was just an amazing group of presentations. Thank you all so much. I learned a lot about the region. And actually, that's the word that I want to use in asking the question, which is, what are the prospects for starting to think on a regional scale? Because all the presentations really talked about St. Louis, not just in terms of its kind of local conditions, but how it's connected, to the region around it, whether it's the ecological or political region. And there have been attempts, over the course of the 20th century, as many of you know, to create regional governance structures, to try to sort of bust through these kind of fragmented conditions. But what are the prospects at this point for creating more regional governance structures or political systems?
Not much.
Okay.
I think the challenge is this. Of all the episodes of efforts to sort of stitch the county and the city back together again to establish more regional governments, my favorite is from the 1980s when a planner sits down and rather fancifully redraws the municipalities in the region as like the South Pole, as pie slices that go from the river. So everybody gets a little bit of downtown, a little bit of sort of substandard city housing, a little bit of inner suburb, and a lot of outer suburb. And then it's like, fund your schools, do economic development, that sort of thing. And I think, it didn't go anywhere, but the idea was interesting. I think the challenge in this sort of fragmented setting that I described is, it's this century-long game of musical chairs where everyone thinks they're going to win. And, the principal villain in much of the story that I tell in my book is St. Louis County. St. Louis County is now the principal victim, at least the inner suburbs of the county. And the fact that every municipality, particularly in this sort of crazy point of origin sales tax competition that goes on, thinks that they might win. And one even gets the sense reading the combined annual financial reports of the city of Ferguson, which is struggling throughout this entire period. But they always think, if we tiff a Walmart and we get a Walmart and Jennings doesn't get it, maybe we'll be fine. And that the sort of perverse local incentives, I think, really act as a barrier to any sort of meaningful cooperation.
So
Well, I think so I would say the municipalities in St. Louis County, which existed, as I described, largely to poach the city of its tax resources and its people during the middle years of the 20th century, is now itself being poached by St. Charles and outer counties. And if you look at various measures of neighborhood distress and poverty and unemployment, these simply migrate from the city out into that crescent of communities that sit between the city and the airport. And so, Ferguson, which, eagerly hosted Klan meetings in the 1930s, is now a very different place. And so I think, in one respect, what you see in the city of St. Louis is both the sort of sustained success of segregation and its spectacular failure. The fact that it moves spatially in such a way to sort of constantly upset the possibility for political change.
Maybe I'm going to ask a question. I didn't see anybody up there, but I kind of following through with this idea of region, thinking about it ecologically, spatially, politically, et cetera, which is you put on the table. I guess a question I have for the panel, I was really struck by the difference between East St. Louis and St. Louis. Maybe we got a really positive picture from Ken. But thinking a little more about the physical location of East St. Louis with respect to governance in the state of Illinois, its isolation, part of that state, but its isolation. It had to a certain extent, the advantage of being out of the kind of big conversation about what's happening in possibly the rest of the state, in Chicago. And then on the other side, you have this fragmented terrain, politically fragmented terrain in Missouri, where you get the sense that that fragmented puzzle is really central to the conversation in the state of Missouri about politics in the future of the region, well, this region of St. Louis. It seems to me a lot of that goes back to the historical story that we have about the kind of the legacy of the history of Missouri as a state with the compromise and how that writes itself on the spatial fragmentation, on ideas of race, whiteness, etc. So I guess I'm trying to ask a question about the kind of territorial place of St. Louis in the state of Missouri, and whether that's a reason why we might not see some of the successes that Ken has showed us in the East St. Louis place. In other words, the advantages of so-called backwardness in East St. Louis allowed the city to come together and do something in ways that I don't see much promise for the city or the metro region of St. Louis to come together and claim a different identity for that region in the state of Missouri.
I have a partial historical response, which is, I didn't emphasize this, but one of the things that I've been struck by in my study of St. Louis is actually the radical history of St. Louis. And so in a way, I'm not accepting the premise of the difference. I mean, the first general strike in the United States was in St. Louis in 1873. The first sit-down strike was at Emerson Electric in 1836, I think. I mean, there was a vigorous radical labor community, including African Americans, ambiguously including African Americans, never successfully including African Americans, that I think persists to this day. So if you talk to Percy Green, who climbed the arch in 1864, Percy Green is somebody who walked a picket line with Herschel Walker, who was the black president of the Communist Party in St. Louis in the 1930s. And Percy Green, somebody who is in conversation with Tef Poe, who was one of the organizers or one of the principals in the uprising in Ferguson. And so I guess what I'd want to gesture at is the consequential character of that tradition, and the fact that it is, it's not simply what happened. And I think Professor Gordon said this in a way. What happened in Ferguson happens 100 times a year, hundreds of times a year in the United States of America. A policeman shoots a young, unarmed black man. But what was different was that people turned out and they were organized and they stayed out day after day after day as it got cold, as it rained. And that, to me, is the product of this sort of decades-long tradition of radical organizing. So, you know, and then I look at what happened at the University of Missouri. I'm from Columbia. I am well aware of the rednecky character of the Central Missouri. But what happened to me there was also a product then of that radical black tradition that has stayed alive in spite of everything that's happened in St. Louis. So I just want to hold on to that a little bit.
I'm wondering, you all have deep resources and knowledge about this area. It seems like we're missing a thread, which is the economic thread. I mean, we heard last night passionately about what's needed is education and jobs. We talked about resources here today, physical, resources of the land and incredible people, the women in East St. Louis and the activists. But where's the money going to come from? I mean, are you talking about the region? Because if we stretched out the responsible physical geographic area, there would actually be those resources out there that have some of them moved out along with people who've moved out of the city? Or is there a really need for a whole new injection of money into this area? I mean, what needs to be accomplished? I mean, you can pull it and pick it and reorganize it from the funds that might be available on a public nature, but we need something that feeds itself and keeps it going and employs people. I didn't really hear the economic story except about the Rust Belt and maybe misnamed it, the potential maybe of the agricultural, resources of the area. But where are we going to put that together, and what might be out there that could be harvested?
I mean, I would just point to two important elements. One is that the St. Louis economy is not strong, has not been strong for a century. And in fact, city planners, Harlan Bartholomew among them, started worrying about white flight at the end of World War I. I mean, they're saying, we're going to lose. It's a 19th century economy centered on the river. It's struggling economically, and that's a big part of the story. And it's what's remarkable about the sprawl of St. Louis West, into the Missouri cornfields, is that the city has not grown in substantial ways, economically or demographically. The population of St. Louis today is about 1.5, 2 times what it was of the metro area, what it was in 1930, and it takes up 12 times the land area. 10% of the population live in the city of St. Louis. So you have that sprawl despite the lack of growth, despite a lack of economic prosperity. The other thing that I think is notable about St. Louis and helps to distinguish it from more moderate successes like Pittsburgh and other places is St. Louis has a notoriously short-sighted business community that has not done itself any favors. They're always fighting the last war. They're always trying to save downtown when downtown is gone. And they're playing inside this fragmented political structure in which to play the game is to lose it. It's a sort of beggar your neighbor game of musical chairs in which, in order, I mean, I always think of it in such a way, if Walmart is looking down at Google Earth of St. Louis, they're saying, we're going to have 10 stores. And then everyone competes as to who gets the 10 stores, and Walmart doesn't pay any taxes. Or it all gets rolled, and it's not like you've got more investment for the metro region.
Right. So I'm just suggesting we need to talk in this day or in years that follow about a major new injection of something that really breaks through that change. I mean, when I was working in St. Louis in the late 90s, it was fantastic to work there. It still seems to be the case that it's supported by these foundations. There's fabulous foundations. They support thinking and writing and research, but all of those together can't get the number of jobs that are needed for the amazing people that are in St. Louis. And I had the sense then it's reached some limits of going out, and there was a real sort of push that could bring people back, because only so far people are willing to commute out, and there was hope for that change. But it sounds like it hasn't been as much since then as I thought. Anyway, something to continue.
In deference to Professor Gordon, I just want to put on a tiny little footnote, which I think it is important to not only imagine, to not let the narrative of decline be the only way that we understand inequality in St. Louis. Right? So St. Louis is a city which has, by some measures, 2 of the wealthiest suburbs in the United States of America, out of 25. St. Louis, crappy in decline St. Louis, right? So the point being that there are thriving businesses within St. Louis that are not paying taxes, that are getting away with not contributing to the community. And so it may be that, as well as a story of large-scale historical decline, we can find a story of structured inequalities of the businesses that are actually there and are actually thriving, and the sorts of disadvantage that they are creating rather than addressing.
But I do think also that this is, again, where the fragmentation of the region is a part of the question that gets in the way. So you have the competition to the bottom because of the history of the fragmentation of the region, and that's a huge, obstacle to kind of move forward, even to get people to talk about economic development, but I don't want to talk too much. I see there are three questions. We're going to pile them all together because we're already running into our coffee break or whatever. So we'll pile them, the three questions, then we'll let the panelists say some final things if they want. Oh, four, okay, four.
Oh, sorry.
Yes.
I have the microphone.
Okay,
so
you have a
I get to
microphone,
speak.
go.
I just wanted to ask about the sort of longer legacy of Missouri as a slave state. And Colin was talking last night about how slave states have a tradition of low property taxes, and which ties in, I guess, to the question just being asked. So that Missouri continues to have this sort of long history of low property taxes. And I guess I just wanted to hear kind of how that plays out and how to respond to that, especially given that it is something that comes out of Missouri's longer history.
I don't think there's time for this,
We're
but
gonna
I think
pile
it's
questions.
really important, and I'd like to have all the panelists respond, but they won't have time to do it, to the idea of the complexity of the pattern of fragmentation and racism that you've so eloquently outlined, and the other regional patterns. And that's class, income, occupation. The famous St. Louis Post-Dispatch series in, was it 1950? Progress or Decay. There's a picture of the suburbs by price point of like 5 different little houses that you can get in different areas. It's the other picture that I saw, I think I saw Miles Davis up there for a second. If memory serves, his father was a doctor, dentist. He was a dentist. So I'd like to get a feel for the diversity within these groupings. There's an African-American professional class. There are the whites. I understand whiteness, but you'd hate to stereotype a whole race. There are a lot of different ethnic but particularly occupational income groups, and that plays out and makes the challenge in East St. Louis, everywhere, a little more complicated. So at some point, I'd love to hear about that.
Remember, the more questions, the less response, but I guess I see 2 more, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, hi. Considering this fascinating, very troubling history of violence in St. Louis, I'm just wondering, my question has to do with how your thoughts about urban history as a normative project on its own, in deciding, say, St. Louis's future politically and economically. And my question is whether there have been any federal or state institutions that have done anything to use historic preservation as a platform from which to argue for St. Louis's revitalization in future. I mean, considering what we heard yesterday about dilapidated housing, and I mean the whole discussion began with the physical artifact that is St. Louis. We've heard. I'd love to know what you think about whether historic preservation has at all been a focus.
Last question up there? Yeah.
The answer is yes.
Do you have a question? Is somebody up there?
Just a quick comment. At what scale do you operate? I think, Diane, you started by saying moving from the universal to the particular, and I think it was a fascinating panel which started by, a burned human being hanging from a tree, ending with trees ready for deployment, and in the middle we visited a neighborhood that was strangled and cut off, and trash bags in the middle of the street that you can't drive around. So maybe we'll get to this in panel 4, but at what scale do you grab people's attention to start at? Because starting from the universal is difficult. Those particular moments seem easier for people to latch onto in terms of how to move forward. So just a thought.
There'll be plenty of time for conversation as the day unfolds, so why don't we take it at that and let all the panelists have final comments if they'd like to these questions or anything else. Colin, we'll start with you down there.
Yeah, I just think it's important to understand the region's fragmentation. I mean, it's not a matter of, even in the St. Louis County suburbs, of relatively equally positioned postage stamps engaged in this sort of race to the bottom. That in fact you have very diverse municipalities, some very wealthy, some very poor, some of which, all of which, or many of which started with different motives, with different ideas of how they would develop and how they would grab tax base. So we're going to avoid all commercial development, or we're going to bring on the big box retail. This changes over time with changes in the state tax system. So at the time the suburbs are developed, single-family large lot zoning is your best fiscal ticket. After Missouri's 1980 Hancock Amendment, and which dampens property assessments, that's not enough, particularly in settings like Ferguson with very small property footprints. So what you end up with is these very differentially positioned municipalities, some of which are thriving, some of which are struggling, but they can generally avoid each other in this sort of game of musical chairs that goes on in the county. And to Maggie's question about the property tax, yeah, I think this is fundamental because, slave states dampened the taxation of property because slaves were property. So in Missouri, unlike in most other parts of the country, municipalities have never relied very much on property taxes. It's always been like 15, 20%. So a setting like Ferguson, where they get 12% from property taxes and 20% from municipal fines and forfeitures, is not unusual. What do these states rely on? They rely on deeply regressive sales taxes, and they rely heavily on intergovernmental revenues, which dry up.
Just to respond to just a couple of things. One is it may be that the suburbanization of poverty and the graying of the baby boomers may create a situation in which increasingly inner ring and second ring and third ring suburban areas outside of St. Louis begin to experience many of the same issues that the central city has, maybe in different degrees. And there could be the potential out of that shared pain for reconsideration of their common interest and potential regional cooperative opportunities. Memphis, which has suffered many of the same consequences in terms of fixed size of economy, fixed size population, and extraordinary low density development, has now, it's beginning to see a very vibrant regional cooperation movement around planning open spaces, greenways, bikeways, et cetera. It was the low-lying fruit that they could easily agree on. And as a result of that common ground, they're now having conversations about the more difficult issues, public schools, local job generation, and economic justice. And who would have thought in Memphis? So that's exciting. Around the issue of preservation as a strategy, in East St. Louis, one of the first really visionary plans was done by Katherine Dunham, the great dancer, choreographer, civil rights leader with Buckminster Fuller, the Old Man River plan, putting the entire city under a geodesic dome, but the generator was going to be the creative arts. And Ms. Dunham spent the latter part of her life, 30 years, trying to make that happen in East St. Louis. Really an extraordinary story that also hasn't been given its adequate attention. So those are just a couple of quick reactions.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's fascinating. I too am, I guess, interested in the question of scales which can be actionable, but also feel like there's some sort of change and some sort of change over time, or how you think about things over time. Because I think, in a sense, the fragmentation is on the one hand a result of complex planning, but is also such a difficult, we don't really train ourselves to think about fragmentation as kind of designers and planners. We're much more comfortable with things that are continuous and things that are large scale. And so I think also just trying to hone our tools to deal with something that is piecemeal, because more and more we get that kind of condition in front of us. So I think that's something important to kind of tease out of these conversations.
Yeah, just a couple of little footnotes and then one idea. By using the phrase whiteness, I didn't mean to suggest that all white people are evil, which I may or may not actually believe. But the point was actually to gesture to a certain kind of class analysis where there are non-slave holding white people whose claim to inclusion is a white supremacist claim, who are advancing that in conflict with slaveholders. And that was a muted portion of this draft. I think the legacy as a slave state is really, really interesting. I mean, St. Louis is the site of the first general emancipation in the United States, and that has partly to do with the radical tradition of Germans in St. Louis. But what happens then is that there's no reconstruction in St. Louis. Reconstruction to the extent that it happens elsewhere, which is at moments extraordinary, is largely rolled back, but that never happens in St. Louis. And St. Louis is also the heartland of what you could call liberal republicanism in the 1870s, which is the notion that what we need to do is develop the economy more generally and not pay specific attention to African American civil rights. So there's a really complicated history that I think does serve as a foundation for this. The thing that I want to finish with, though, is the scale of empire. I mean, we've talked quite a bit about city scale, regional scale, state scale, a little bit about national scale. St. Louis is the heartland of U.S. imperialism in the 19th century. It is the place, it's the Western military post. All of the 19th century Indian wars are run out of St. Louis, including the Seminole War, which is in Florida, right? So it is the designated site for U.S. imperialism through the 19th century, and it becomes a defense city. I mean, and so a lot of what we talked about in relationship, if you talk about the East St. Louis race riot, you can't talk about that without thinking about the First World War. You can't talk about Mill Creek Valley without referring to Hiroshima Flats, right? And so there's a set of sort of enduring relationships that I think are worth thinking about between the history of United States imperialism, the history of St. Louis, and then the sort of recalcitrant inequality and segregation within the city and the county.
Well, just as a final comment, I would say what was amazing panel, what I really love the way that we're thinking about the point that you can't think about the territory, the territoriality without thinking about the history. The history writes itself in terms of the patterns of territoriality, including fragmentation. So one final comment I would add, building on several of the prior comments about scale, which is it seems to me that maybe we can be thinking, as the panels unfold today, not just about which scale to intervene in, but how do we understand working across scales simultaneously? What does it take to be able to work across the fragmentation? Is it a political movement? Is it a kind of historical identity? Is it a project? Is it a vision? But how do we start moving beyond the fragmentation that has prevented some of the advances that we'd like to see in St. Louis? So I want to thank our amazing panelists and invite you to stay for the next panel.